The winter arrived early that year, as if nature itself conspired against the exhausted. By December of 1919, the Republic of Latvia had survived more trials than any nation should endure in a generation, let alone a single year. It had been born in uncertainty, invaded by Bolsheviks, betrayed by allies, besieged by mercenaries, and bled across every acre of its contested soil. And still the war continued. To the east, beyond the frozen rivers and snow-covered forests, the region of Latgale remained under Soviet occupation, a wound in the body of the nation that would not heal until it was liberated. The decision to launch a winter campaign was not taken lightly. Latvian commanders understood the risks, moving large formations through deep snow, maintaining supply lines across frozen countryside, fighting an entrenched enemy in conditions that killed men as efficiently as any bullet. But the political calculus was unyielding. Latvia could not claim sovereignty over territory it did not control. International recognition depended on demonstrating effective authority within declared borders. And the people of Latgale, hundreds of thousands of Latvians living under Bolshevik rule, could not be abandoned to their fate. The campaign would be conducted in coordination with Polish forces operating to the south. Poland itself, engaged in a bitter war with Soviet Russia, saw strategic advantage in a joint offensive that would stretch Bolshevik defenses across multiple fronts. The alliance was in perfect historical tensions between. Latvia and Poland complicated every negotiation, but necessity forged cooperation where friendship could not. For the soldiers preparing to march eastward, the coming campaign represented something beyond military calculation. Many of them had families in Latgale, relatives they had not seen since the war began, homes they wondered if they would ever see again. The region was the poorest part of Latvia, its people predominantly Catholic in a predominantly Lutheran country, its dialects distinct enough to be almost a separate language. Latgale's relationship with the rest of Latvia had always been complicated, but its people were Latvians, and Latvians did not abandon their own. The offensive began in January of 1920. As the new year dawned with temperatures that froze breath in the air and turned any exposed skin numb within minutes, the advance was methodical, grinding, brutal. Latvian forces, now better equipped and more experienced than they had been a year earlier, pushed forward against Bolshevik positions that had been fortified over months of occupation. Every village became a potential strongpoint. Every forest concealed possible ambush. The Bolsheviks, though weakened by fighting on multiple fronts, resisted with the desperation of men who knew that retreat meant abandoning the revolutionary dream in the Baltic. The human cost accumulated in ways that statistics could never capture. A young soldier from Riga, barely 19 years old, wrote to his mother from a forward position near Resek, "The cold is our enemy as much as the Bolsheviks. 3 men in my unit froze last night. We buried them this morning in ground so hard it took hours to dig. I wonder sometimes if any of us will see home again." He would be killed 4 days later in an assault on a fortified farmstead. For the civilian population of Latgale, the campaign brought hope and terror in equal measure. They had endured Soviet rule with its requisitions, its ideological persecutions, its systematic destruction of traditional social structures. Now a different army approached, one that claimed to bring liberation, but that was still an army. With all that implied for the communities in its path, the peasants of Latgale had learned over months of occupation the art of survival through invisibility. They hid their grain in secret cellars, dispersed their livestock into the forests, maintained blank expressions when soldiers asked questions. When the Latvian forces arrived, these same instincts activated. It took time, days, sometimes weeks for civilians to trust that this was not simply another wave of violence that would eventually recede, leaving them to face the consequences of whatever allegiance they had shown. A village elder near Ludza described the moment of liberation in terms that captured both the relief and the caution. "They came in the morning, flying our flag. At first we did not believe it. We had seen so many flags. We waited to see if they would take our food, our horses, our sons. When they did not, when they sat with us and shared what little they had, then we began to believe. But even then, we kept the grain hidden, just in case." The fighting in Latgale produced some of the war's most intense engagements. The capture of Daugavpils, the region's largest city, strategically vital for its railway connections, required house-to-house combat that lasted for days. Soviet forces, recognizing the city's importance, had fortified it extensively and defended it with determination. When Latvian troops finally secured the city on January 3, 1920, the streets were cratered with shell impacts, and the civilian population emerged from cellars gaunt with hunger and trembling with relief. But liberation was not simply a military matter. It required the reconstruction of civil society in communities where the social fabric had been deliberately torn apart. Schools had been closed or converted to ideological purposes. Churches had been desecrated or shuttered. Local leaders, mayors, priests, teachers, anyone with traditional authority had been arrested, executed, or driven into hiding. The work of rebuilding what the Bolsheviks had destroyed would take years, even decades. For the soldiers who conducted this campaign, the psychological burden accumulated with each passing week. They had begun the war fighting for abstract concepts: independence, sovereignty, national honor. By the winter of 1920, they were fighting for something more concrete: the faces of people they liberated, the gratitude of families reunited, the knowledge that their sacrifices had meaning beyond strategy and geopolitics. A lieutenant named Pavel Bermondt-Avalov kept a journal during the campaign that was later preserved in the National Archives. His entries oscillate between operational details and philosophical reflection in ways that reveal a mind struggling to process experiences that exceeded normal comprehension. One passage, dated January 15, 1920, reads, "We took a village today that the Bolsheviks had used as a prison. In the barn behind the church, we found bodies, perhaps 30. Some had been shot. Others showed signs of worse. I ordered my men to bury them before the civilians returned. There are things that should not be seen, even if they cannot be unseen." The campaign continued through January and into February. By late February, the last significant Bolshevik forces had been pushed back across the agreed demarcation lines. Latvia was free, or as free as any region could be after such devastation. The guns gradually fell silent, replaced by the sounds of reconstruction, hammers on wood, shovels in earth, the voices of children cautiously emerging from months of fear. For the Latvian National Army, the end of active combat brought exhaustion rather than celebration. These men had been fighting, in some cases, for over a year. They had watched friends die, killed enemies who were often their own countrymen in Bolshevik uniforms, endured cold and hunger and fear beyond civilian imagination. The transition to peace required its own kind of courage, the willingness to put down weapons, to return to lives interrupted, to become farmers and workers and fathers again. Not all of them would make this transition successfully. The psychological wounds of the war, invisible but profound, would haunt many veterans for the rest of their lives. Some would find themselves unable to speak of what they had experienced, carrying memories in silence until death released them. Others would struggle with anger, with nightmares, the difficulty finding meaning in peacetime existence that modern psychology would recognize as trauma, but that 1920 lacked the vocabulary to name. For the civilian government, the end of combat operations meant the beginning of a different struggle, transforming military victory into political legitimacy. The Republic of Latvia had defended its territory against enemies foreign and internal, but it had not yet been recognized by the major powers whose acknowledgement would secure its place in the international community. And the war had left the country economically devastated, its infrastructure destroyed, its population displaced and traumatized. The negotiations that followed would determine whether everything that had been sacrificed had been worth the cost. In Moscow, the Bolshevik government had reasons of its own for seeking peace in the Baltic. The Russian Civil War continued to rage across vast territories, consuming resources and attention that could not be spared for secondary fronts. The international intervention against the Soviet regime, though failing, still complicated strategic planning. Settlement with Latvia and the other Baltic states would allow the concentration of forces elsewhere while establishing a precedent for coexistence that might ease Soviet isolation. The diplomatic discussions began in spring of 1920, conducted in an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and pragmatic calculation. Neither side trusted the other. Both sides needed an agreement. The Latvian delegation, led by experienced diplomats who had witnessed their country's near destruction, approached the negotiations with a combination of firmness and flexibility that reflected hard lessons learned. As summer approached, the outlines of a treaty began to emerge. The Soviet government would recognize Latvian independence and territorial integrity. The Latvian government would declare neutrality in the ongoing Russian Civil War. Borders would be established, prisoners exchanged, and diplomatic relations normalized. It was not a treaty of friendship, too much blood had been spilled for that, but it was a treaty of finality, a recognition that the war was over and would not resume. The date set for signing was August 11th, 1920. And as that day approached, every Latvian who had survived the preceding 2 years allowed themselves, perhaps for the first time, to imagine a future without war